The Google Drive notification appeared while I was halfway through lunch at work, staring at a spreadsheet I had already been pretending to focus on for almost 2 hours. At first, I barely paid attention to it because people in my family accidentally shared documents constantly, especially my older cousin Melissa, who treats Google Drive like a second nervous system for the entire family. Every holiday, doctor appointment, birthday dinner, and minor crisis somehow ends up inside a shared folder eventually. So seeing a random notification from her honestly did not feel unusual enough to think about twice. The notification said she had shared a file called Family Housing and Support Planning 2026, which sounded exactly like the kind of aggressively organized document Melissa would create after drinking too much coffee on a Sunday afternoon. I clicked it mostly out of curiosity while finishing microwaved chicken from a plastic container at my desk, expecting nothing more dramatic than a holiday schedule or another complicated rotation plan for helping my grandmother get to medical appointments. When the spreadsheet opened, that assumption initially seemed correct. Most of the tabs looked completely ordinary for my family. There were sections for holiday hosting, transportation schedules for my grandmother's cardiology visits, emergency contacts, budgeting estimates, and temporary housing plans in case another relative ended up needing help unexpectedly, which honestly had become a recurring issue over the past few years. My younger cousin Tyler bounced between jobs often enough that temporary situations had basically become part of the family vocabulary at that point, so nothing about the document immediately felt alarming. What changed the feeling slightly was a tab labeled Housing Contingencies. Even then, I would not say some dramatic alarm went off in my head. The discomfort started much smaller than that. It felt more like one strange sentence during an otherwise normal conversation, the kind that barely registers at first but stays in your thoughts afterward for reasons you cannot immediately explain. The spreadsheet listed different relatives alongside possible backup living arrangements if emergencies happened. Most of it still looked practical enough because there really had been several unstable situations inside the family over the last few years. My Aunt Linda went through a messy divorce, Tyler nearly got evicted twice, and my grandmother's health had become unpredictable enough that everybody quietly started planning around worst-case scenarios without openly calling them that. Then I noticed my own name showing up repeatedly throughout the housing section, usually attached to comments explaining why I was considered one of the more flexible backup options if somebody in the family suddenly needed help. One cell described me as the strongest backup option. Another mentioned that I was more flexible than most if approached correctly. Lower on the page, another comment explained that I was a good emergency housing possibility because I worked remotely part of the week, had no children, and lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. I remember rereading those lines slowly because the wording felt strangely impersonal once I realized they were talking about me. Nobody sounded cruel exactly, and that honestly made the situation more uncomfortable, not less. If somebody had openly insulted me or written something obviously manipulative, the reaction would have been simpler. Instead, the tone throughout the document sounded calm, practical, and emotionally detached, like relatives discussing weather patterns or insurance options instead of another person's emotional limits. Then I noticed there were attached comments. One from Melissa said that I usually agreed to things if conversations stayed emotional instead of financial. Another from my Aunt Karen warned people not to ask me too early because I tended to overthink things. The comment that actually made me stop scrolling for a moment came from my mother. She wrote that if my grandmother talked to me first, the chances of me agreeing to help were usually much higher. That part sat with me differently than the rest, because my grandmother really had helped me during the worst period of my divorce a few years earlier. When my marriage collapsed badly enough that legal fees wiped out most of my savings, and I spent 2 months rebuilding my life inside a tiny apartment with borrowed furniture, my grandmother mailed me checks quietly without ever making me feel ashamed for needing help. She called it getting back on your feet money and refused to let me repay any of it afterward. Seeing that history later referenced inside a planning strategy made something shift uncomfortably in my chest because the document suddenly stopped feeling like harmless organization and started feeling more like a map of everybody's assumptions about me. What disturbed me most was realizing that none of the people writing these comments probably believed they were doing anything wrong. The spreadsheet did not read like a conspiracy. It read like a family that had quietly started organizing parts of their lives around the expectation that I would always absorb pressure if things became difficult enough. And once that idea settled into my head, I kept scrolling instead of closing the document, which was probably the exact moment the situation stopped being a weird accident and became something I could no longer unknow. I should have closed the spreadsheet right there and called Melissa immediately, because a normal person probably sees something uncomfortable, exits the document, and pretends they were never supposed to read any of it in the first place. Instead, I clicked into the version history almost automatically, partly because curiosity had already taken over by then, and partly because the document no longer felt accidental once I realized how specifically people had been discussing me inside it. That was the moment the situation started feeling much larger than one badly worded spreadsheet comment. The document history stretched back almost 2 years, and the more I scrolled through revisions and archive tabs, the more obvious it became that this was not some temporary planning sheet created during a family emergency. Melissa had been updating it constantly over time, adding comments, reorganizing sections, renaming tabs, and archiving older versions instead of deleting them entirely. My Aunt Karen appeared throughout the revision history almost as often as Melissa did, while my mother commented less frequently, but still enough that seeing her name attached to certain discussions made the entire thing feel strangely personal, in a way I could not easily separate from the rest of my family memories. What unsettled me most was how normal everybody sounded. Nobody wrote like they were plotting against me. Nobody mocked me or talked about taking advantage of me directly. The tone throughout the spreadsheet sounded calm, practical, and weirdly cooperative, like relatives discussing travel plans or insurance paperwork instead of quietly organizing another human being's emotional limits into categories and probabilities. One archive tab labeled Backup Plans 2024 focused mostly on my younger cousin Tyler during the period when he nearly lost his apartment after getting fired from another warehouse job. I remembered that period well because the entire family spent months rotating through anxious conversations about whether Tyler was actually trying to stabilize his life or simply drifting from one crisis into the next while everybody else cleaned up the fallout around him. At the time, I believe the stress came mostly from concern. Reading the spreadsheet later, I realized there had been a second conversation happening underneath the visible one the entire time. One comment from Melissa explained that if Tyler lost the apartment completely, I was probably the safest short-term housing option because my apartment was calmer and more stable than most of the other available places. Underneath that, my Aunt Karen suggested people should avoid framing the situation as long-term too early because I would likely become resistant if I felt trapped immediately. Then my mother added that if my grandmother spoke to me first, there was a much better chance I would agree without overthinking the situation. I remember staring at that section for several seconds because the disturbing part was not that they were entirely wrong about me. If Tyler had genuinely become homeless, I probably would have helped him. That was exactly why reading those discussions felt so uncomfortable. Helping somebody after they ask for help directly feels very different from discovering that multiple relatives already built plans around the expectation that your answer would eventually become yes, if approached correctly enough. I kept scrolling after that, even though the entire experience had started creating this heavy feeling in my chest that was difficult to describe properly. Part of me still wanted to believe I was overreacting because families discuss complicated situations privately all the time, especially when housing, money, aging parents, and unstable relatives become recurring problems. Another part of me, though, kept noticing how often the document described me less like a family member and more like an available resource that simply needed to be managed carefully. One section discussed long-term rotation possibilities, which sounded corporate enough by itself that I almost laughed reading it. The tab included columns tracking available bedrooms, work flexibility, emotional reliability, transportation access, and what Melissa literally labeled as pressure points. Under my name, somebody had written that I responded more predictably to guilt connected to family history than to direct financial requests, which was apparently considered useful information for future conversations. That comment bothered me enough that I physically leaned back from my desk for a moment. Not because it was inaccurate, because it was accurate in a way I had never fully realized other people noticed too. Growing up, I had always been the dependable one in the family. I was the relative people called when furniture needed moving, when somebody needed a ride to the airport at 5 in the morning, or when an emergency happened and everybody else suddenly became unavailable. I used to take pride in that identity because reliability felt like one of the few genuinely useful things a person could offer the people they cared about. Now I was staring at a spreadsheet where those same personality traits had slowly been translated into strategic planning information over a period of years. The worst part was realizing none of the people involved probably thought they were doing anything cruel. The document did not read like a conspiracy. It read like a family that had gradually become so accustomed to relying on me that eventually they stopped separating my willingness to help from actual guaranteed access to my time, space, and emotional energy. And once that thought settled properly into my head, older memories started rearranging themselves almost immediately. About 8 months earlier during Thanksgiving dinner, my Aunt Karen spent nearly half an hour asking detailed questions about my apartment renovation. At the time, I thought she was simply making conversation because relatives ask boring homeowner questions constantly once you hit your 30s. Sitting there at work with the spreadsheet open in front of me, though, I suddenly remembered the specifics differently. She had asked whether my office could fit a bed comfortably, whether parking near my building was difficult overnight, whether my landlord seemed strict about guests staying long-term, and whether I planned on downsizing eventually if I kept living alone. I even remembered making a joke about it at dinner. I laughed and asked if she was planning to move into the apartment herself. Everybody at the table laughed too. Now, staring at archive planning notes I was never supposed to see, I realized there had been an entirely different conversation sitting underneath that moment the whole time, and I somehow never noticed it while it was happening. I stayed at work almost an hour later than usual that night without finishing anything meaningful, because every time I tried focusing on actual work, my attention drifted back toward the spreadsheet sitting open on my second monitor. The worst part was not even the comments themselves anymore. It was the growing realization that the document had quietly started rearranging old family memories inside my head whether I wanted it to or not. Because once certain patterns become visible, your brain automatically starts connecting them to moments you never questioned before. The spreadsheet history stretched back far enough that I could actually watch certain conversations evolve over time. Earlier versions sounded more cautious and vague, while newer revisions became increasingly specific about who could help with what, who handled pressure well, who needed emotional framing first, and which relatives were likely to cooperate without creating conflict. Reading through it felt strangely similar to overhearing coworkers discussing office management strategies, except the subject being managed was my own family. One archived section focused almost entirely on future planning around my grandmother's health, especially what would happen if she eventually needed assisted living or long-term in-home care. None of those conversations shocked me because everybody already understood those possibilities existed, even if nobody liked saying them out loud yet. My grandmother was still independent for the most part, but age had started introducing small realities into the family routine that nobody could ignore anymore. She forgot appointments occasionally, stopped driving after backing into a pharmacy sign last winter, and needed more help getting through winter safely than she ever would have admitted herself. What unsettled me was how quickly those practical conversations drifted toward me specifically. Melissa described me as financially stable without dependence, while my Aunt Karen pointed out that my remote schedule made me more adaptable than most. Then my mother wrote a sentence that honestly stayed in my head for the rest of the evening after I finally drove home. She wrote, "Evan usually steps up eventually once he has time to process things emotionally." That wording bothered me because it sounded less like a casual observation and more like a conclusion built slowly over years of watching me respond to family situations in predictable ways. The more I thought about it, the more I realized she probably intended the comment as praise. In her mind, being dependable was one of my better qualities. The problem was that inside the spreadsheet, dependability no longer sounded like part of my personality anymore. It sounded like planning data. I closed the laptop for a while after reading that, and just sat quietly at my desk while the office emptied around me because my thoughts had started drifting backward through old conversations automatically. Small moments I had never questioned before suddenly felt slightly different once I viewed them through the context of the spreadsheet. I remembered my cousin Melissa encouraging me last year to keep the second bedroom in my apartment instead of expanding my office space during renovations. At the time, she framed it as resale advice and talked about how extra bedrooms always increase flexibility long-term, which honestly sounded reasonable enough that I barely thought about it afterward. Sitting there rereading the spreadsheet later, though, I realized the family had probably already been mentally categorizing that room as emergency housing space before I even finished repainting the walls. Another memory surfaced almost immediately after that one. About 2 years earlier, not long after my divorce finalized, my mother came over one Sunday afternoon with groceries because I had reached the point where I was basically surviving on frozen meals, caffeine, and stress without fully realizing how bad things had gotten. She spent most of the afternoon helping reorganize my apartment while telling me people think more clearly when their surroundings feel stable. At the time, I appreciated it more than I can properly explain because my entire life felt emotionally wrecked back then, and having somebody quietly help without making me feel pathetic honestly mattered a lot. What unsettled me later was finding an old spreadsheet comment thread connected to roughly the same period. Melissa joked that my apartment had finally become functional enough for future flexibility if needed, and underneath it my Aunt Karen responded, "Good thing Diane convinced him to keep the guest room." I stared at that comment for a long time because suddenly a memory I always associated with my mother helping me through one of the hardest periods of my adult life now carried this second uncomfortable layer underneath it that I could not completely separate anymore. And that was the part that exhausted me emotionally more than anything else. If my family had sounded openly manipulative or cruel, the situation honestly would have been easier to process. Instead, the spreadsheet felt like evidence of something much messier and far more realistic. My family still loved me. I genuinely believe that. But somewhere over time, love and dependence had slowly blended together until people stopped noticing where one ended and the other began. The deeper I went into the document history, the more obvious it became that everybody had gradually adapted to the assumption that I would eventually absorb pressure if situations became serious enough. Nobody discussed it dramatically because from their perspective it probably no longer felt dramatic. It just felt practical. Then I found a partially hidden tab labeled Communication Notes. And that section changed the emotional tone of the entire situation almost immediately because it had nothing to do with housing or money directly anymore. The tab focused entirely on how different relatives should approach difficult conversations depending on who they were speaking to and what type of response they usually triggered emotionally. Tyler's section mentioned that direct honesty worked best because he reacted badly to feeling cornered. My Aunt Linda's notes explained that emotional discussions should happen privately because she became defensive in group settings. Reading those sections already felt invasive enough before I reached my own name. My section explained that I responded poorly to direct pressure, but became significantly more cooperative when requests were framed around helping specific individuals instead of the family as an abstract concept. Another note mentioned that conversations involving my grandmother worked particularly well because I struggled emotionally with disappointing her directly. I physically leaned back from the screen after reading that, because suddenly years of family conversations started making sense in ways I honestly wished they had not. I drove home that night with the spreadsheet still open in my head the way a song gets stuck in your thoughts long after the music stops playing. Even after closing the laptop at work, parts of the document kept replaying themselves automatically while I sat in traffic, especially the communication notes section, because that part felt the hardest to explain away as harmless organization. Planning around money or temporary housing was one thing. Quietly documenting how different relatives respond emotionally during difficult conversations felt entirely different once I actually saw it written down. The frustrating part was that none of the observations were completely wrong. I really did struggle more with disappointing specific people individually than dealing with abstract family pressure as a whole. If somebody asked me directly for money, space, or help, I usually slowed down and analyzed the situation carefully before agreeing to anything. But if the conversation became emotional enough, especially if my grandmother or mother got involved, my resistance often weakened faster than I liked admitting even to myself. Seeing those patterns recognized so clearly by other people made me feel strangely exposed. Not manipulated exactly. Mapped. By the time I got home, I had already started mentally replaying old family conversations differently without even trying to. Small moments that used to feel random or forgettable suddenly seemed connected in ways I never noticed while they were actually happening. One memory in particular kept resurfacing while I made dinner that night. About a year earlier, Tyler asked if he could stay at my apartment for just a couple weeks after another breakup left him temporarily without a place to live. I remember hesitating immediately because Tyler had a long history of temporary situations quietly turning permanent whenever nobody forced boundaries early enough. Before I could fully answer him, though, my grandmother called me later that evening and spent almost 20 minutes talking about how hard things had been for Tyler lately, how embarrassed he probably felt asking for help, and how important family support becomes during unstable periods in life. At the time, the timing felt coincidental. Sitting alone in my kitchen later with the spreadsheet still fresh in my mind, I realized there was a decent chance the phone call had not been spontaneous at all. And what made the realization hurt was that I still could not fully blame anyone involved because my grandmother probably believed she was helping. Tyler probably believed he genuinely needed support. My mother probably viewed the entire situation as family members coordinating during a difficult moment rather than emotionally steering me toward a predictable answer. That was what made the whole thing so mentally exhausting. Nobody in the spreadsheet sounded malicious. The document read more like a family that had slowly adapted itself around certain behavioral patterns over time until those patterns eventually became infrastructure people relied on automatically. I barely slept that night because once my brain started connecting old situations to the spreadsheet, it kept finding more examples faster than I could shut the process down. I remembered how often relatives described me as stable compared to everybody else in the family, especially after my divorce forced me to rebuild my finances carefully from scratch. At the time, I took those comments as compliments because stability was something I fought hard to create for myself after several years where my entire life felt chaotic and financially unpredictable. Now I started wondering how long stability had quietly translated into availability in everyone else's minds. The next morning at work, I reopened the spreadsheet before I even finished my coffee because despite how uncomfortable the entire situation had become, curiosity kept overpowering common sense. I told myself I only wanted to confirm whether I was overreacting emotionally before confronting anyone, but realistically, I already knew I was looking for something more specific than that. I wanted to know how deep the pattern actually went. That was when I noticed another archived section attached to the Communication Notes tab. The title read, Escalation Options. Even opening it felt invasive. Inside were discussion chains about what relatives should do if certain family members refused requests involving housing, caregiving, or financial support. Most of the entries focused on ordinary conflict management things at first, like avoiding group arguments, keeping conversations calm, or giving people time before revisiting emotional topics later. Then I reached my section. One comment from Melissa explained that direct confrontation rarely worked well with me because I tended to shut down emotionally once conversations became openly aggressive. My Aunt Karen responded that guilt connected to specific family history usually worked better long-term, especially conversations involving sacrifice, loyalty, or older relatives needing support. Underneath that, my mother added something that genuinely made me stop scrolling completely. She wrote, "If he feels like people are depending on him personally, he almost always comes around eventually." I sat there staring at that sentence while people around me moved through an ordinary Thursday morning at the office, completely unaware that my entire perception of my family had quietly started shifting over the course of less than 24 hours. Because suddenly I realized something that honestly should have been obvious much earlier. My family did not think they were manipulating me. They thought they understood me. I spent most of the next morning arguing with myself about whether I should say anything at all or simply close the spreadsheet permanently and pretend none of it had ever happened. The more distance I got from the initial shock of discovering the document, the harder the situation became to define clearly because technically nobody had threatened me, insulted me, or openly tried forcing anything onto me directly. The entire problem existed inside this uncomfortable emotional gray area where every individual comment sounded explainable on its own, yet the overall picture still left me feeling increasingly uneasy the longer I sat with it. Part of me genuinely wanted to convince myself I was overreacting. Families discuss each other privately all the time, especially when money, housing, aging relatives, and unstable situations become recurring problems over several years. If somebody accidentally exposed years of text messages or phone conversations from almost any family, there would probably be uncomfortable things inside them. I understood that logically. The problem was that once I saw myself categorized so specifically inside the spreadsheet, I could no longer stop noticing how often my family seemed to view my reliability less as a personality trait and more as a resource they quietly organized around. Around lunchtime, I finally texted Melissa because avoiding the conversation entirely no longer felt realistic after everything I had already read. I kept the message short mostly because I did not trust myself to explain the situation calmly if I started overthinking the wording too much. I wrote, "Hey, I think you accidentally shared that family planning spreadsheet with me." Melissa answered almost immediately. First she sent, "Oh my God." Then another message appeared less than 30 seconds later asking me to please tell her I had not read the entire thing. I remember staring at my phone for a moment before replying because there honestly was not a version of the conversation anymore where pretending ignorance felt possible. So I answered honestly, "I read enough." The typing bubble appeared almost instantly after that and stayed active long enough that I could practically feel her trying to calculate how serious the situation actually was. Eventually, she asked if we could talk later that evening, and by that point, I already understood there was no realistic way to return to normal family interactions without addressing the spreadsheet directly, at least once. Melissa called me around 8 that night while I was sitting alone in my apartment trying unsuccessfully to focus on a basketball game I had not actually been paying attention to for almost half an hour. The thing that surprised me most once the conversation started was that she did not sound angry or defensive immediately. Mostly, she sounded embarrassed in the specific, exhausted way people sound when something private accidentally becomes visible from an angle they never expected another person to see. She apologized first for accidentally sharing the document, then almost immediately started explaining that the spreadsheet wasn't supposed to sound bad, which honestly became one of the central themes of the entire conversation afterward. I told her the problem was not one individual comment or one specific section of the document. What unsettled me was the overall experience of reading years of conversations where relatives seemed to discuss me less like a person participating voluntarily in family situations and more like a predictable variable inside a planning system. There was a long silence after I said that. Eventually, Melissa sighed quietly and said something that honestly shifted the entire conversation into a direction I had not fully expected. She told me families do this more often than people realize, and the way she said it did not sound cruel or manipulative. If anything, she sounded like somebody genuinely trying to explain something she believed was normal rather than defend malicious behavior. When I asked her what she meant exactly, Melissa explained that over time families unconsciously adapt themselves around certain people. The dependable relatives become the ones everybody calls first during emergencies because history teaches people they will probably answer. The emotionally reactive relatives become the ones difficult conversations get softened around. The unstable relatives become the ones everybody quietly builds backup plans for whether anyone openly admits it or not. Then she said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended because part of me hated how reasonable it sounded once I actually thought about it carefully. She said, "The spreadsheet just made all of it visible." After that, Melissa started explaining how the document originally began years earlier during my grandmother's first serious health scare, when the family realized nobody actually had organized plans for transportation, medical coordination, temporary housing, or financial emergencies if multiple problems started happening simultaneously. According to her, the spreadsheet was originally supposed to reduce chaos by tracking practical information before situations became overwhelming emotionally. And honestly, that explanation made sense. The uncomfortable part was realizing I could actually see how a family slowly drifts into something like this without anybody consciously deciding to become manipulative. A practical conversation about helping relatives during emergencies eventually becomes planning around reliability, then planning around personalities, then eventually planning around emotional responses, because after enough time, people stop thinking of those observations as personal anymore. They start treating them like logistical information instead. I eventually asked Melissa why the communication notes section even existed if the spreadsheet was only about organization, And there was another silence after that question long enough that I could hear her thinking carefully before answering me. She admitted the family created those notes after several situations involving Tyler became emotionally explosive because different relatives kept approaching conversations in ways that immediately triggered arguments, guilt spirals, or people shutting down completely. According to Melissa, the notes were originally intended to help people communicate more carefully and avoid unnecessary conflict during stressful situations. I remember laughing quietly after hearing that explanation because hearing emotional pressure reframed as conflict reduction somehow made the entire thing feel even stranger than before. Melissa heard the reaction in my voice immediately and started defending herself more directly after that. She insisted nobody viewed me as free housing, emergency money, or somebody whose life existed purely for family convenience. According to her, people trusted me because I was calm, emotionally stable, and usually dependable even during situations where everybody else became reactive or chaotic. Then she said something that honestly explained the spreadsheet better than anything else during the entire conversation. She told me I had slowly become the person everybody trusted would still help even after situations became difficult, emotional, or exhausting. That sentence probably should have sounded flattering. Instead, it mostly made me realize how easily reliability turns into expectation inside families once people stop separating appreciation from access. After the call ended, I sat in my apartment for a long time without turning the television back on because the conversation with Melissa had shifted the situation into a place that felt emotionally harder to argue against. If she had sounded manipulative or cruel, the entire thing honestly would have been simpler to process. Instead, she sounded sincere almost the entire time, which forced me to confront the possibility that the spreadsheet existed less because my family consciously wanted to exploit me and more because everybody had slowly adapted themselves around patterns that nobody bothered questioning anymore. That realization stayed with me over the next several days in ways I did not expect. I started noticing how differently I listened during family conversations once the spreadsheet existed in the back of my mind. Nobody behaved dramatically. Nobody suddenly revealed themselves as villains. Family dinners still sounded like family dinners. My mother still asked whether I was eating properly. My grandmother still called twice a week to complain about the weather, politics, or whichever neighbor currently irritated her. Tyler still bounced between overly ambitious career plans and vague financial instability with the exact same chaotic energy he had always carried. Objectively, nothing had changed, at least not for them. For me, though, ordinary conversations started feeling layered in ways I could not fully undo anymore, because every interaction now carried the possibility of hidden coordination underneath it. Once you accidentally discover people discussing your emotional patterns privately, it becomes difficult to stop wondering how many conversations reached you already shaped by planning you never saw happening. About 4 days after speaking to Melissa, my mother called while I was grocery shopping and casually asked whether I still planned on renewing my apartment lease later that year. Before the spreadsheet, I probably would not have thought anything about the question because parents ask boring logistical questions constantly once you reach your 30s. Standing in the frozen food aisle holding pasta sauce, though, I immediately found myself wondering whether the question connected to another family discussion I simply had not seen yet. And that was the part one hated most. The spreadsheet had not only changed how I viewed my family, it had changed how I interpreted completely normal interactions too. I answered carefully, told her I had not decided yet, and the conversation moved on normally after that. Even so, I spent the rest of the shopping trip replaying the exchange in my head, trying to determine whether I was becoming paranoid or simply more observant than before. A week earlier, I never would have analyzed that phone call at all. Now I caught myself analyzing everything. The worst moment happened the following Sunday during dinner at my mother's house. Most of the family was there because my grandmother wanted everybody together before one of my cousins moved out of state for work, and for the first hour or so the evening honestly felt normal enough that I almost convinced myself the spreadsheet mattered less than I originally thought. People talked about work, sports, rising grocery prices, and my Aunt Linda's ongoing divorce situation, while my grandmother complained that nobody visited enough anymore despite the fact that relatives rotated through her house almost constantly. At some point during dinner, Tyler started talking about his apartment problems again because his landlord apparently planned to raise rent once the lease expired in the fall. I listened quietly while everybody offered suggestions because under ordinary circumstances the conversation itself would not have bothered me at all. Then my Aunt Karen looked directly at me and said, "At least Evan's setup would probably work temporarily if things got really bad." The table barely reacted. Tyler nodded absent-mindedly while eating. My mother kept drinking iced tea like nothing unusual had been said. Melissa glanced downward for maybe half a second before returning to the conversation normally. And suddenly I realized something that honestly disturbed me more than the spreadsheet itself. Nobody at the table thought the comment sounded strange. That was what finally made the entire situation feel real in a way it had not before. The spreadsheet was not some secret conspiracy hidden away from reality. It was simply the written version of assumptions that had already existed quietly inside family conversations for years. I remember looking around the table realizing everybody there probably viewed the situation completely differently than I did. In their minds, Tyler potentially staying with me during a crisis did not feel invasive or manipulative because they already categorized me as one of the stable people inside the family structure. My apartment existed mentally alongside spare bedrooms, reliable transportation, financial stability, and emotional dependability as part of the same larger support system everybody unconsciously relied on. And the more I sat there listening to the conversation continue normally around me, the more exhausted I started feeling emotionally because I realized I no longer knew how to separate genuine family love from gradual dependency anymore. After dinner, while everybody cleaned dishes and moved around the kitchen, Melissa quietly pulled me aside near the hallway and asked if I was okay. I remember looking at her for a second before asking something I had not fully admitted to myself yet until that exact moment. I asked her whether anybody in the family still saw me as a person first anymore, or whether I had slowly just become the reliable one permanently. Melissa looked genuinely caught off guard by the question. Not defensive, actually sad. And the fact she needed several seconds to answer probably hurt more than the spreadsheet ever did. Melissa eventually answered my question quietly, while people moved around the kitchen behind us cleaning dishes and packing leftovers into plastic containers. She told me the family absolutely still saw me as a person, but after hesitating for a few seconds, she admitted that everybody had also become used to relying on me in ways they probably no longer noticed consciously anymore. According to her, the process happened gradually over such a long period of time that nobody ever stopped to think carefully about where appreciation ended and expectation quietly began. That answer stayed in my head for weeks afterward because deep down I already knew it was probably true. Nobody in my family intentionally decided one day that I should become permanent emotional infrastructure for everybody else's emergencies and instability. The process happened slowly through years of me consistently being dependable enough that reliability eventually stopped feeling exceptional and simply became part of the family structure itself. Every time I solved a problem, stayed calm during chaos, rearranged my schedule to help somebody, loaned money without making people feel ashamed, or showed up during difficult situations when everyone else became overwhelmed, the family adapted around the assumption that I would probably continue doing those things indefinitely. And honestly, part of that expectation existed because I rarely pushed back strongly enough for anybody to fully recognize where my limits actually were. Over the next month, nothing dramatic exploded inside the family, yet the atmosphere around me still changed in ways everybody seemed to notice without openly discussing them. I stopped volunteering personal information automatically during conversations, especially details involving finances, apartment plans, work flexibility, or long-term goals. When relatives started describing problems that sounded like they might eventually become requests, I stopped immediately offering solutions before anybody even finished speaking. I also started taking longer to answer certain phone calls whenever conversations carried that familiar emotional buildup that usually appeared before somebody asked for help. Nobody confronted me directly about the shift at first because the changes were subtle enough that they mostly registered as distance rather than open conflict. My mother began asking more frequently whether everything was all right because, according to her, I seemed distracted lately. Tyler became noticeably more cautious whenever conversations about housing or money happened near me, and my Aunt Karen completely stopped making casual comments about my apartment altogether which honestly told me she understood more about my discomfort than she probably wanted admitting openly. The hardest adjustment emotionally involved my grandmother, because for a while I caught myself unconsciously pulling away from her too, even though none of this was really her fault. Every time she called asking for small favors like rides to appointments or help fixing something around the house, part of my brain immediately flashed back toward the communication notes section describing how difficult it was for me to disappoint her directly. I hated that reaction immediately because my grandmother had spent most of her life helping people without keeping score, and reducing her kindness into emotional leverage inside my own head felt unfair to both of us. Eventually, I drove over to her house one Saturday morning to replace a broken kitchen light fixture because avoiding her entirely started making me feel worse than the spreadsheet itself ever did. While I was standing on a chair near the sink, trying not to drop screws into the garbage disposal, she asked me whether I was upset with the family lately. The question caught me off guard mostly because she sounded genuinely concerned instead of suspicious. I climbed down from the chair and asked her why she thought that, and she shrugged before telling me families notice changes even when nobody talks about them directly. Then she mentioned that my mother felt like I had become more careful around everybody recently, and hearing that word affected me more than I expected because it described the change perfectly in a way I had not managed articulating clearly even to myself yet. Before finding the spreadsheet, family interactions felt automatic and emotionally uncomplicated most of the time because I never stopped to analyze every emotional layer underneath ordinary conversations. Afterward, though, I started listening differently without even meaning to. Every request, compliment, suggestion, or emotional discussion suddenly carried this second invisible layer where I found myself wondering whether I was responding naturally to another person or reacting to a version of myself the family had already mapped out psychologically years earlier. I tried explaining some of that gently to my grandmother without mentioning the spreadsheet directly, because I honestly did not want her carrying guilt over conversations she probably barely understood herself. I simply told her I had recently realized how often dependable people become responsible for emotional weight that nobody else fully notices anymore. She listened quietly for a while before telling me that strong people inside families often get treated like solid floors in old houses because everybody walks across them constantly without thinking very much about the pressure underneath, keeping everything supported. That sentence stayed with me for a long time afterward because it described the situation more accurately than almost anything else during the entire experience. My family still loved me. I genuinely believe that even now. The problem was that love alone does not automatically stop people from becoming comfortable with access over time, especially when one person consistently makes life easier for everyone around them. Once relatives start organizing parts of their lives around somebody always being available emotionally, financially, or logistically, they eventually stop noticing how much invisible pressure that creates for the person carrying it. The spreadsheet simply exposed the process in writing before anyone involved realized how uncomfortable those assumptions actually looked from the outside. These days, my relationship with the family still exists, but it works differently now because I finally started separating love from automatic availability in ways I never really had before. I still help when I genuinely want to help, I still answer calls, and I still show up when situations truly matter, but I no longer treat every family problem like an obligation that automatically belongs partly to me the moment it appears. And interestingly enough, once I stopped behaving like permanent backup infrastructure for everyone else's lives, some of the family dynamics quietly adjusted on their own over time. People became more direct instead of emotionally circling conversations for 20 minutes before asking for things. Tyler eventually found a roommate instead of hinting about staying with me temporarily again. My mother stopped casually asking detailed questions about my finances and apartment plans. Melissa deleted the spreadsheet completely a few weeks later, although by that point the document itself no longer mattered very much because the real change had already happened long before it disappeared. The strangest part is that sometimes I still miss the older version of family relationships a little, the version where conversations felt emotionally simple because I never realized how many assumptions quietly existed underneath them. Life honestly felt easier back then, even if some of that comfort only existed because I had never fully understood how much of myself other people believe they could automatically depend on forever.